This was supposed to be the triumphant return of a rock god to the airwaves. It was meant to be the start of a new empire, built from the ashes of an old one. Instead, it became one of the biggest, most expensive, and most baffling train wrecks in modern radio history. In just 4 short months, a living legend went to war with his own radio show, his bosses, and his audience, and he ultimately lost. This is the story of how David Lee Roth, the iconic frontman of Van Halen, was handed the keys to the kingdom and promptly drove the car off a cliff. How did it all go so wrong, so fast? Tune in to find out. Before we get started, be sure to hit the bell notification icon and put all notifications on. I hear from a lot of my subscribers that they don't even get notifications when I post my videos. I would greatly appreciate if you guys did that. So Howard Stern has been in the news lately with rumors flying that he may be retiring from his Sirius XM show. I've seen some comment that David Lee Roth should replace him, which got me thinking back to the time 20 years ago David Lee Roth actually did replace him. The news surrounding Stern lately has to do with Sirius possibly canceling his show, which isn't entirely true. His contract runs out this year, and if you've been a Stern Show listener like myself, every time his contract is about to expire, it always comes down to the wire for whether he'll sign or won't. I personally stopped listening to his show years ago, and to me, the show died after Artie left. But there was one moment in time when Stern's listeners knew of the Shock Jock's plans years in advance, when in 2004 he announced he was heading to Sirius Satellite Radio. Stern's broadcast on the subscription service wasn't slated to begin for nearly 2 years. Sirius offered the Shock Jock a reported $500 million deal over 5 years, and because it was a subscription service, the federal government, who had previously regulated Stern's broadcasts, couldn't touch him. Stern promised to his listeners that he'd be uncensored and could literally do whatever he wanted. So in December of 2005, the self-professed king of all media broadcast his final show on terrestrial radio. For 2 decades, Stern wasn't just a radio host, he was a cultural institution, a ratings juggernaut who commanded a loyal audience estimated at 20 million listeners at his peak. For his parent company, CBS Radio, he was a golden goose. In his biggest markets like New York City, Stern's show was rumored to pull in as much as 75% of a station's total ad sales. His jump to the uncharted territory of subscription-based satellite radio wasn't just leaving a gap, it was creating a black hole in the company's finances. CBS was panicking. They needed a replacement, and not just any replacement. They needed a personality so huge, so magnetic, that they could stop the bleeding. They needed a star, and Stern Show listeners got the scoop first. On October 25, 2005, Howard's producer, Baba Booey, came into the studio and told Howard he had a mystery guest, and this guest was going to be replacing Stern the following year. Stern's sidekick, Artie, guessed that it was going to be comedian Bill Maher, while Stern jokingly guessed comedian Pat Cooper or Richard Simmons. It turned out the mystery guest and Howard's replacement was none other than David Lee Roth. On paper, you could almost see the logic. This was Diamond Dave, the swaggering, high-kicking, larger-than-life frontman of one of the biggest rock bands on the planet. Roth was a born showman, a world-class storyteller with a reputation for being wildly eccentric and unpredictable. Former CBS executive Rob Barnett later admitted that Roth was only hired because he was the only guy with an ego large enough to even think he could replace Howard Stern. Roth's interview with Stern that morning was mostly jovial. The frontman contended that he was not replacing Stern, but rather just taking over his time slot, and that he was going to be doing a different type of show. They took calls from the listeners, with one joking that if Roth's radio show fails, Sammy Hagar should replace him. The plan was ambitious. CBS rebranded rock stations in major markets to Free FM, a new talk-heavy format designed as a direct counterattack against the subscription models of Sirius and XM. It was a declaration of war on the new media landscape, and Roth, with a reported $4 million contract, was their new general. The hype was enormous. Billboards across New York City promised a thunderbolt in your Cheerios. The stage was going to be set for the coronation of a new king. The only problem was that the man that they hired had no intention of wearing the crown they'd made for him. On January 3, 2006, millions of former Howard Stern listeners across the East Coast tuned in, desperate to hear the future of morning radio. What they got was pure, unadulterated chaos. This wasn't Howard Stern Part 2. This wasn't even recognizable as morning radio. It was Well, something entirely different. From the very first broadcast, it was clear that Roth wasn't playing by the rules. His show was a bizarre, free-form monologue that sounded more like a pirate radio broadcast than a major market production. Instead of the shock jock bits and celebrity gossip that Stern's audience craved, Roth delivered rambling personal stories, odd intellectual debates, and a constant soundscape of looping musical beds. He'd put on the intro to a Kool and the Gang song or some Arabian Night-style music and just talk right over it. Roth wasn't trying to be a shock jock. He was creating a deeply personal, almost psychedelic vibe. He played obscure world music and non-commercial rock, and his guests were people that he found interesting, not who the audience necessarily wanted to hear from. Critics immediately savaged at the show, calling it amateurish and bewildering. The audience, who was conditioned by 2 decades of Stern's finely tuned machine, was completely alienated. The ratings didn't just dip, they cratered. In the first month, Roth lost nearly 3/4 of Stern's audience in New York City, with the market share plummeting from a 7.9 to a 1.8 share. Now, I do want to point out that years later, Roth did go on Joe, I Think I'm a Comedy Assassin, Rogan, and claim that his ratings didn't go down, but rather they went up, and CBS was upset about this because they couldn't control the frontman. Behind the scenes, the meltdown was just as fast. Former CBS executive Rob Barnett said that the train wreck began on day 1 or 2 when Roth got in the chair and simply wouldn't listen to anyone that was there to do only one thing, to help him. He wouldn't even do ads for products he claimed he didn't use. CBS executives were horrified. They had a product to sell and their star player was refusing to even learn the game. They wanted a show for a 35-year-old white male who likes Leonard Skinner or Nickelback. Roth, in his own words, was playing, and I quote, black music and having, and I quote, black fun humor. It all boiled down to a fundamental misunderstanding. CBS thought they were hiring a personality to plug into their machine. Roth believed he'd been hired to, well, be himself. He later said that executives wanted a repeat of what Howard Stern was doing, and he refused, famously telling them he was hired to be, and I quote, a first-class David Lee, not a third-class Howard Stern. Roth saw himself as an artist creating something new. CBS saw an insubordinate employee sabotaging their multi-million-dollar investment. The pressure kept mounting. Management sent letters demanding changes, like drop the music, fire his entourage, talk about current events, add sports, even bring in a female newscaster. For a couple days, CBS even pulled him off the air for not following orders. When he did come back, the show was stripped down, but it couldn't fix the core problem. Roth was, as he later admitted, uncontrollable. He knew his style was an acquired taste and refused to change for anyone. By early April, with his first official ratings book looming, everyone knew the end was near. Roth seemed to sense it too, and in a final act of defiance, he simply stopped caring altogether, and it showed. He started bad-mouthing CBS execs on the air, and in one famous segment, he spent his time, and I'm not kidding you guys, just reading newspaper comics to his baffled listeners.
You want to read the funnies?
I was thinking about that since you turned the page.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. On behalf of Tom Gisano, we're going to read the funnies. Galaxy Insurance. Regretfully, we are declining your application for life insurance. And there's a picture of an old man with a Martian. Girls and sports. Okay, there's a picture of a guy looking at a girl. And then she runs away. And somebody says, welcome to my life. Then we have the Flying McCoys. Tell me more about these feelings of inferiority. And there's a psychiatrist sitting with his legs up on the patient.
Talk about a giant middle finger to management. The war was over before the first battle had even been fought. The end finally came with stunning and brutal speed. On the morning of April 21st, 2006, just 4 months after his grand debut, David Lee Roth was in a car on his way to his Manhattan studio. That's when he got the call minutes before going live that his show was canceled. He was fired effective immediately. He went on the air one last time, not to entertain, but to declare war. He stated, "It's official. Today is my last day. I was booted, tossed, and it's going to cost somebody." He openly hinted at suing CBS for the rest of his $4 million contract, even mentioning that he had spoken to Howard Stern's lawyer. Now, if you guys remember, Howard was also sued by CBS around the time he went to Sirius Satellite Radio because they were unhappy with him promoting Sirius on his show. Roth had claimed that he had postponed touring plans to accommodate the radio show, and therefore CBS owed him the rest of his contract. It was a final defiant roar from a star whose radio experiment had publicly and catastrophically imploded. The implosion also triggered a falling out with Stern himself. Before Roth took the job, the two had been friendly for years, with Roth being a frequent and popular guest on Stern's show. But once Roth was named as Stern's replacement, the dynamic between the pair soured. Stern publicly piled on, criticizing Roth's show and gloating about its failure, making it clear he always knew Roth would fail because he didn't respect the medium or understand it. Their friendship fractured under the corporate pressure and public failure. David Lee Roth hasn't been a guest on Stern's show since 2005 when he came into the studio to announce he was replacing the shock jock. CBS Radio didn't even wait for the dust to settle. They fired Roth just days before the official Arbitron ratings were set to be published, a clear sign they knew the numbers were a bloodbath and wanted to get ahead of the story. Then, in a move dripping with irony, on April 24th, just 3 days after his firing, CBS announced his replacements, Opie and Anthony. This was the same shock jock duo that CBS's previous corporate entity had fired years earlier for a controversial stunt. The message was loud and clear. The grand experiment was over. Immediately following his firing, Roth went on Fox News and discussed the matter.
For a day or whether I'm on for a year, at the end of the day, I sing for my dinner, and I kept my day job. And I think we brought something really unique to the radio. I think they expected a nice, quiet kind of corner candy store in the morning, and I gave them one, but we had Tony Soprano selling guns out of the back room, so to speak.
Yeah, but you know, they didn't give you enough time. I mean, you were just coming in after a legend. It's always hard to do. People don't often remember the guy who came after Abraham Lincoln.
Oh,
so
you know what?
That's tough, right?
That's an excellent point, and I think the fellas who followed me were always their plan to put together the size contract, the heavy lifting size contract that the subsequent act must have done would have taken at least a year.
All right, now Opie and Anthony came in after you, and they're supposedly twin shock jocks. You were not considered a shock jock. You were just, you know, new to this whole profession. Are you angry at CBS? Are you angry at Les Moonves?
No, I think that they're probably a little bit towards trying to repeat the past, and I want to try and take something into the future. I think we had something really unique,
Did
really
you ever
exciting.
hear from Les Moonves? Did he ever call you?
No, and none of the top doggies did. We were kind of, you could have named the show Inherit Howard Stern's Old Problems.
It did result in a brief feud with his replacements, Opie and Anthony.
Is one of the things that some of those who commented had to say. Opie and Anthony said this about former Van Halen frontman: "You got fired because you sucked. Nobody listened." Those were one of the kinder comments. Joining me now to respond to all of this, because he's here in the flesh, is David Lee Roth.
Is it not curious that their first ratings came in exactly as mine did? The exact same ratings that happened in New York, same ratings that happened in almost all the cities, except I've never done radio before, and these fellas are veterans.
On Joe Rogan's podcast, Roth reflected on the experience, saying he would have prospered if radio executives had given him space to simply be himself rather than expecting a duplication of a hero. Roth characterized himself as an acquired taste, pointing out that the team at CBS didn't want to allow him to do his own thing, despite initially telling him to be yourself. Instead, their constant meddling stifled the potential for the show to grow organically, he claimed. Looking back, the David Lee Roth radio show was a perfect storm of ego, mismanagement, and impossible expectations. But it's also a story that feels more relevant than ever. First, the tragic flaw of our hero, hubris. David Lee Roth is a rock star, and he approached radio like one. He failed to grasp what Howard Stern himself later pointed out. Talking to a faceless microphone is fundamentally different from commanding a stadium of 20,000 fans. He was an artist who refused to learn the craft. But CBS Radio was just as guilty. They wanted the brand of David Lee Roth, but weren't prepared for the reality of the person. They asked a peacock to bark and then got angry when all it would do was show off its feathers. Finally, there was the impossible ghost of Howard Stern. Anyone stepping into those shoes was probably doomed. But the story's timelessness comes from what's happening to Stern himself right now. His contract with Sirius XM is nearing its end, and insiders claim the company is unwilling to meet his massive salary demands, with some citing his declining cultural relevance and listenership. After years of being a cultural insurgent, critics and even myself claim that Stern has lost his edge and is no longer relatable, alienating old fans with political tirades and sounding more tired than provocative. In the end, the legacy of the David Lee Roth Show is a cautionary tale about the brutal realities of corporate media. Format and finances are king. It's a lesson that is coming full circle. The king of all media, who once watched his replacement get crushed by the machine, is now reportedly facing the gears of that same machine himself, reminding us that in the world of media, no empire lasts forever. Let me know, guys, what do you think is next for Howard Stern, and who do you think was more to blame for Free FM's failure, Diamond Dave or CBS? That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.